You're watching KRQE News 13.
We are less than 24 hours away from Thanksgiving, and of course that's a holiday that brings families and friends together every year. Well, Thanksgiving is one of our nation's favorite and most reliable traditions. However, it wasn't always that way here in the U.S. or even here in New Mexico. And with Turkey Day upon us, we're going to be joined right now, but this morning, by historian Raffi Andonian, and talking about, taking a look back rather, at the Founding Fathers, what they ate, and how we all began celebrating Thanksgiving here in New Mexico, as well as throughout the rest of the country. Raffi, great to have you with us.
Grateful to be here,
yeah.
Especially for Thanksgiving.
Absolutely, and like you said, it's the build-up, you know. Sometimes it's like the anticipation of the day coming up. So let's hit the history on this. Where does it all begin?
Well, it depends how you look at it. So I look at Thanksgiving, well, we think of Plymouth, right, in 1621. That's what everyone thinks of with the harvest, but I would say that that's not really the first Thanksgiving. There's a couple of reasons for that, but one of them is that it's not really the United States at the time. We are looking backward, and they later became the United States almost 200 years later. But I would say the first Thanksgiving starts with George Washington. George Washington, when he's president, shortly after the Constitution is put into place, commemorates a day of thanks in November. Oh. He declares it as president. He does a proclamation. Well, that set the tone and the tradition for each president after that to set a day of thanks. But here's what's interesting. It always moved around. It wasn't always on the same day.
Okay.
So, you know, it was in November, but it moved around depending on what the president wanted. And some presidents didn't even want to do it. Thomas Jefferson, for example, the third president, he said it's too close to compare having religion and the government intertwined, so he didn't even want to do it at all. So it varied quite a bit. Abraham Lincoln, during the Civil War, obviously a very tough time in the history of the country, he really starts to establish what I think we start to see the beginnings of what we would recognize as Thanksgiving. But the closest thing to modern Thanksgiving doesn't start until Franklin Roosevelt, who moved it actually up in November a little bit to give a longer shopping season for Christmas, until eventually Congress in the early 1940s sets it as a fourth Thursday in Thanksgiving. That's when we start to celebrate it the way that we see it. So really, if you think about it, it's only 2 or 3 generations old, the way that we will recognize it.
First of all, who knew Jefferson was such a downer? Second of all, I mean, we're also, Thursday. Why Thursday? It always kind of like boggled my mind why they said it on that day. But
it's a precedent with George Washington. He said it on a Thursday, and much like many other things, we just follow George Washington's precedent. It's the same thing. We just follow his precedent in that regard. Now, when the Founding Fathers would feast, a little bit different world, right? We have these candles today to, you know, set the mood for us in, let's say, if you're having people over. But back then, they're having these candles for lighting. That's how they're lighting up the room.
There you go.
And it's really fascinating because they had these 20-course feasts. Now, they wouldn't do Thanksgiving the way that we recognize it, but they did have feasting. They had their main meal, dinner, usually, even on a regular day, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So if they were going to do a feast, they would still start at 2 in the afternoon, but they go until 6, 7 at night, having 20 courses coming out. Very different food than we would have today, much saltier or much sweeter, depending on what you're looking at. But a lot of meat, not a lot of fruit and vegetable. Was kind of looked down upon to eat a lot of that. A lot of founders got gout. It's really interesting.
Wow.
But this is how they lit the rooms.
There you go. And again, you know, obviously no technology of microwaves at that time, so you had to just cook it fresh, keep it coming for those many courses. It's very interesting. So let's take a more of a local look. Let's see how New Mexico got in on the celebration.
Well, remember earlier we were talking about, you know, the first Thanksgiving. You can kind of have this debate of what the first Thanksgiving is, and I think of it as with the United States. However, if you go before the time of the United States, Plymouth tries to claim that, but New Mexico has something similar that happens before Plymouth. So Plymouth was in 1621. New Mexico does something in 1598. Now that year might sound familiar to some folks because, of course, that's the year that Don Juan de Oñate is coming up into New Mexico. He had just gotten permission from the Spanish crown to come up, roughly what we would consider the El Camino Real de Tierra Adentro, that he's coming up from Mexico City. So they cross the river near El Paso. Remember, that's not part of Texas at the time. There is no Texas. And when they cross the river, having been through a treacherous journey, it happens to be on the day of Ascension in 1598, 40 days after Easter. So they pause. They're grateful they made it through the journey. And he declares everything across on the other side of the river, what we recognize New Mexico and beyond, for the crown. And for that, they give thanks. They have a ceremony with friars, colonists that he's with, and these folks. And that's what many people would argue is the first Thanksgiving. If we go back to the colonial era, I don't think it's Thanksgiving the way we think of it, but if we're going to have this discussion of Plymouth, I think New Mexico certainly has a case to make because of that.
There you go. And we keep on that pioneering spirit here in New Mexico. We do it first. We do it well. Real quick here, Raffi, where can we find more information?
For the Thanksgiving, you can look all over the place. The White House actually has some information on that.
Oh, wow.
You can look on some of the Santa Fe Museum websites that have information for the first Thanksgiving. You can, so for the White House, you see the presidential proclamations, and then, of course, for New Mexico, you see the museum websites.
Raffi, thanks a million. Happy Thanksgiving, and we'll be right back.